name is Zaid Hassan, and I am an imam, a man of faith, and a servant of Allah who has spent years of his life guiding people. My family and I welcomed this journey with hope, believing it to be part of Allah's plan, but I knew life was about to take a turn I could not have predicted for decades. For decades, my life revolved around the mosque and the teachings of the Quran from dawn to dusk. I had been a pillar in my community, offering wisdom, consolation, and support to those who sought me out. Moving to the United States was supposed to be an opportunity to bring the light of Islam to new shores. I prayed, gave advice, and gave sermons that reminded my congregation of Allah's justice and mercy. People would come to me with their problems, uncertainties, and anxieties, and I would reassure them that faith is strong. I felt that my faith was unwavering, or so I thought, and that I was ready for whatever test Allah had planned for me. However, it started the year I turned 69, and I began to have I initially thought my stomach pains were just indigestion, but when they got worse, my wife insisted that I see a doctor. I was hesitant at first, but I finally gave in, assuming it would be a minor problem. After weeks of tests, scans, and consultations, the doctor informed me that I had stage 4 stomach cancer. The words felt like a death sentence, but deep down I knew that this was not an accident. Rather, it was a trial and a test from Allah, just as Prophet Ibrahim had been tested when he was told to sacrifice his son. I vowed to face this test with courage and faith. The treatment started almost immediately, and the chemotherapy was a torturous cycle of nausea, pain, and exhaustion. My body grew weaker with each session, but I refused to give up. Every moment of suffering turned into a chance for prayer, and as the medication dripped into my veins at night, I whispered supplications under my breath. At night, when I couldn't sleep, I would refer to the Quran, reciting verses that reminded me of the wisdom and mercy of Allah. O Allah, I would pray, if my time has come, let me meet you in peace. Despite my resolve, there were moments when doubt crept in. The pain was relentless, and there were days when I could barely lift my head from the pillow. I would stare at the ceiling, wondering why this was happening to me, but I reminded myself of the stories of the prophets, of their trials and tribulations, and how they never wavered in their trust in Allah. This was my path, and I was determined to walk to the end, no matter how difficult. One evening, after a particularly difficult chemotherapy session, I returned home feeling more drained than ever before. As I sat in my chair, a strange tightness began to build in my chest. At first, I thought it was just fatigue, but the sensation grew sharper and more unbearable. My breathing became shallow and panic set in. I tried to call out to my wife, but the words wouldn't come. The last thing I remember was collapsing to the floor as darkness enveloped me. When I opened my eyes, I wasn't in my body anymore. I should have been horrified, but instead I felt a peculiar tranquility as I looked down at the scene below, where my wife was screaming and had her hands clamped over her mouth in terror. Paramedics had arrived and were conducting chest compressions on my lifeless body. After my heart stopped, I tried to speak to let them know that I was still here, but nothing came out. I was a silent observer, floating above the chaos. And then I noticed a faint light in the distance. It wasn't harsh or blinding, but it was warm and inviting, and I felt compelled to approach it as if it were calling. As I hovered over my lifeless body, the scene below started to fade, and for a brief moment, all of the pain, fear, and confusion vanished. However, this was just the beginning. What lay ahead would challenge everything I believed I knew about life, death, and the truth I had spent my entire life preaching. They worked frantically, their voices urgent, but their words sounded muffled, like if I were listening to them through water. My wife's sobs broke through the chaos, and I wanted desperately to reassure her that I was still here, watching everything unfold, but no matter how hard I tried, my voice didn't reach them. It felt like I was tethered to a different plane of existence, separate but painfully aware, and I felt more alive than I had ever felt before. I could see everything clearly, feel the energy in the room, and even sense the emotions radiating from the people around me. Despite the panic below, I felt a strange calmness. There was no fear or confusion, just a quiet acceptance of my state. If this was death, It wasn't what I had imagined. Then I noticed a light, but it wasn't coming from the room or the medical equipment. Rather, it was somewhere far away, and it seemed to beckoning. I experienced an intense need without any resistance to move closer. As I drifted toward it, the scene below began to blur and fade, replaced by a warmth that enveloped me like a soft embrace. As I drew nearer to the light, faint sounds began to echo in the distance. At first they were indistinct murmurs, but gradually they grew clearer. It was my mother's voice singing a lullaby she used to hum when I was a child. I hadn't heard that melody in decades as yet. It stirred something deep within me, a longing that I hadn't realized was still there. Then came my father's voice reciting a prayer before the evening at Han, just as he had every night when I was young. These sounds were not just memories, they felt alive, vibrant, as if they were happening right now. The light seemed to hold all the pieces of my past within it. As I moved closer, I saw flashes of my life, moments I'd forgotten, small fragments of joy and sorrow, my childhood home, the mosque where I first led a prayer, the faces of people I had counseled over the years. It was as if the entirety of my existence was being laid bare in the glow of that light. I had never felt such completeness and harmony before, but something changed. The warmth started to fade and was replaced by a chill that crept into the air, and the light that had been steady and inviting flickered and dimmed. I thought that this was the presence of Allah, because I felt no fear and only an immense peace. I tried to concentrate, to hold on to the peace I had felt moments ago, but it was slipping away. The surroundings started to change. The bright glow was gone, replaced by a dim gray haze. The ground beneath me was no longer soft and warm, but now it was cold and unyielding. I looked around and saw trees, but they weren't the lush green trees of paradise. Instead, they were withered and blackened, their branches twisted and lifeless. The air was heavy with the scent of decay, and every breath felt like a struggle. And then came the sounds, which began as faint moans in the distance, almost imperceptible at first. But as they became louder, the sounds of men, women, and even children screaming in agony filled the air. The sounds weren't just audible, they seemed to penetrate into my very being, leaving me with a profound, agonizing despair. I tried to turn away to ignore the sounds, but I was unable to do so. Then, in the middle of the commotion, I heard a voice that stopped me cold. A woman's cry was heard. Raw and desperate, it had a hauntingly familiar quality, and as I realized why my heart sank, I recognized my mother's voice. She wasn't singing in a lobby anymore. Instead, she was yelling for help. I whispered, but nothing came out of my mouth. This couldn't be the darkness. It wasn't simply the lack of light. There was a presence, an emptiness that felt alive, enveloping me, and it got thicker and more oppressive. I felt like I couldn't breathe as it smothered me, pressing down on my chest. I wanted to scream and run, but there was nowhere to go in this darkness. A deep, rich voice spoke, but it wasn't the whispers. It was evident and authoritative, resonating deep within me. Zaid stated that everything would now be made public. The voice sent chills down my spine. It wasn't angry, but it had a weight and a power that made me feel small and unimportant. I didn't know what it meant, but I knew that whatever happened next would change everything. This was no longer a place of peace, but rather of reckoning, and I was at its center. The darkness thickened, engulfing everything in sight. There was no ground, no sky, just an endless, suffocating void that pressed against me from all sides. The cries of suffering were now deafening, echoing from all directions. They weren't just sounds, they carried a weight, an intolerable anguish that seeped into my very soul. The air was heavy with the smell of decay, and every breath felt like inhaling fire and ash. As I moved, or maybe was drawn, through this barren environment, figures started to appear in the darkness, despite my desire to close my eyes and filter out everything. Grotesquely twisted shapes in the midst of the chaos, I saw a throne that rose high above the desolation. Its surface was carved with intricate ancient patterns that seemed alive, writhing in the flickering shadows. It was both magnificent and terrifying, radiating an aura of immense power, but the sight of it filled me with dread. Their faces contorted in eternal agony, and they reached out their hands, clapping at the empty air as though begging for help. Their cries pierced my heart, and I felt their pain as if it were my own men, women, and children trapped in this place of endless and absolute suffering. A figure was sitting on the throne, their head dropped low, hiding their face, and they were bound in heavy chains. The shackles on their wrists and ankles were unbelievably large, and their weight was pulling the figure downward. Their posture was one of complete defeat, and I was unable to turn away, even as horror took hold of me. Who was this heart, and why were they present? My breath seized in my throat as the figure slowly raised their head. His face was recognizable as that of Prophet Yusuf, whom I had mentioned innumerable times in my sermons. The man whose tale of hardship and mercy had motivated generations, but here he was. His eyes were filled with grief and remorse, and he was chained and dejected. "No," I said, my voice barely heard in this area. "This can't be. It's not possible." I felt an enormous flood of pain when Prophet Yusuf's eyes met mine. It wasn't just his anguish, it was also my own, multiplied and reflected back at me. I wanted to shout and demand answers, but my body wouldn't cooperate, so I just stood there when his lips twitched but no sound came out. I was paralyzed by the enormity of what I was witnessing. This must be an error. He is a prophet and a chosen one, so why is he in this place of torment? These were the questions that raced through my head, each one more agonizing than the last, because I thought he didn't belong here. Thought that had the same deep, resonant voice that had spoken out to me before. Zayd spoke again after I was unable to perceive the truth. It said, "Do you see now? Do you understand? No?" I eventually broke free by shouting back my voice. The voice didn't respond, but the darkness surrounding me started to change, and I'm not sure why he's here or why I'm here. I saw scenes from my own life where I had preached about faith and salvation and had reassured others with words of hope, but then the scenes changed. I saw moments I had forgotten, when doubt had entered my heart and I had questioned the very things I taught others. These doubts, though brief, now stood before me as undeniable truths. "Why is this happening?" I asked, my voice shaking. "I served you. I dedicated my life to you. Why am I being shown this?" "You've always looked for the truth, Zayda." But the voice spoke again, this time weaker but no less strong. "Have you actually located it? Do you really know me?" Naturally, I knew Allah since I had dedicated my entire life to him, but as the voice replayed in my head, I realized that I had never really questioned myself. Who is Allah? And what does it mean to truly know him? My deep-seated doubts started to come to the surface, and I felt as though my foundation was collapsing. Desperate for answers, I turned back to Prophet Yusuf, but his unwavering gaze was filled with a sorrow that mirrored mine. Tears streamed down my face as I fell to my knees, feeling as though everything was pressing down on me. I cried out to him, "Why won't you tell me what this means?" There was only quiet in answer, the overwhelming darkness and silence that enveloped me. In a world where even the prophets seemed to suffer, I felt lonely and abandoned as I knelt there, my once unwavering faith suddenly feeling shaky and unsure. Everything I had believed and everything I had preached was being put into doubt. Perplexed, one last time the voice spoke. As I knelt in the suffocating darkness, broken and devoured by bewilderment, I realized that nothing would ever be the same again. "Zayd, the fact is that before you have the guts to confront it." I didn't know what the voice meant, or what I was supposed to do. I had spent my entire life preaching about Allah, helping others understand his mercy, justice, and omnipotence. But here, in this strange place, that question felt different, heavier, sharper, as if it pierced through everything I thought I knew. My lips moved to answer, but no words came out. The voice returned, deeper and more resonant than before. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, reverberating in the very core of my being. "Who is God?" The question struck me like a blow. The words echoed endlessly in the void. Naturally I knew Allah. I had prayed to him, repeated his words from the Quran, and devoted my entire life to serving Him. However, in this emptiness, my convictions felt flimsy and unclear, and the question resurfaced. I held my chest, the weight of those words crushing. This time, they were louder and more emphatic about who God was. Before I could even try to respond, the blackness surrounding me changed, taking the form of swirling shapes that started to gain clarity and turn into scenes. The first image, which was grand and imposing with walls carved with weird shapes, was almost tangible. People were gathered there, bowing before idols, their faces filled with adoration. I knew right away that this was pre-Islamic Arabia, the period of ignorance. Jala prior to the Prophet's revelations, a circle of hideous, lifeless idols stood, each revered as if they were endowed with divine power. I was familiar with these individuals from the history I frequently discussed in my sermons. The Arabs' false gods, Alat, Al-Uzza, and Menat. But then the voice spoke once more, piercing the landscape to ask, "Where is Allah in this place?" My heart raced when I realized that Zayd was not one of these gods that they prayed to alongside them. The Arabs had believed in Allah prior to the revelation of Islam, but he was regarded as the highest of their gods and was called upon in times of great need, but they continued to worship idols. This historical fact had always seemed far away to me, a remnant of ignorance that the Prophet's teachings had rectified, but in this vision, it felt uncomfortably close. The scene changed once more, and I saw a different land and people. It was Canaan, and the people were gathered around a huge idol that was offering sacrifices, and their chants filling the air. I instantly recognized the idol as Be, the ancient god of fertility and storms, but something about this vision was different. As I looked closer, I noticed an inscription carved into the base of the idol that read, El. I shook when I whispered that name, knowing it to be the ancient Semitic word for, in Hebrew, God used. The revelation hit me like a lightning bolt in both Hebrew and Arabic. Had the name of the one true God been entwined with the ideas of those who worshipped other gods? Were they anyway related? El Baal Allah? I wanted to deny it in order to fight back against the doubts that were racing through my head, but the scenes kept coming, each one more disturbing than the last. I saw the Kaaba as it had been before Islam, surrounded by idols, and I saw people praying to Allah and offering incense to their other gods. Then I saw the Quran itself, its pages turning quickly as if invisible hands were flipping through them, and the verses I knew so well seemed to glow, their words sharp and clear. The voice spoke again, piercing my thoughts. "You have never asked, Zayd. Have you ever wondered who Allah is and what does knowledge mean?" Actually, as I gripped, tears fell down my cheeks. My head stopped. My lungs burned and my body ached as I gasped for air. My eyes opened and I found myself staring at the ceiling of a hospital room as the sounds of the outside world rushed back, including machines beeping, muffled voices, and the hum of fluorescent lights. I cried, "Please stop, I can't take this any longer." But the voice would not stop. It became louder and more insistent, repeatedly asking, "Who is God? What do you truly know?" Then the visions ended, and the darkness was replaced by a blinding light. When I returned, I felt weak and vulnerable, as if I were wearing it for the first time, and a nurse's face materialized over me. "We almost lost you," she remarked in a calm but forceful voice. Her words hardly registered because I was too distracted by her, the room, and the busy medical team to pay attention. My thoughts were still there, hearing that voice asking, "Who is God?" The question kept coming back to me, refusing to leave. Came back to life, but I was different. The doubts that had been sown in that otherworldly place were still there, eating away at the edges of my faith. Everything I had assumed to be true was now in doubt, including my beliefs, teachings, and prayers. Were they sufficient, or had I overlooked something essential? As the nurse changed my IV and said comforting words, I threw back my head in tears. When I came back to life, everything felt different. My body was weak and my lungs fought with every breath. But the true struggle wasn't physical. It was within me. Welling in my eyes, I didn't know the answers, but one thing was clear. I couldn't ignore the question any longer. The truth, whatever it was, wouldn't let me rest. Who is God? Was the question that tormented me in that faraway place. The visions I had witnessed were vivid and unforgettable. They weren't just dreams, they were etched in my spirit, leaving me to struggle with a fearful doubt. I made an effort to resume my usual regimen, reading the Quran, saying prayers, and going over the activities of everyday life, but nothing felt the same. Each verse and word seemed to compel me to think more deeply, as if asking, "Do you really understand?" I steered clear of my family's inquiries about what had transpired during my near-death experience and how I could explain the darkness. The voice that rocked my foundation, the throne, I couldn't even explain it to myself, but one morning after a restless night, I found myself sitting in the hospital chapel. It was a small, peaceful area for people of all faiths, with simple wooden pews and a cross hanging on the wall. As I sat there, staring at the cross, a man wearing a white clerical collar and holding a small Bible came in. He introduced himself as Father James, and, in a calm and inviting voice, he said, "You seem troubled." At first, I was hesitant to talk about my struggles, but something about his presence made me feel at ease, and before I knew it, the words began to flow. I told him about my illness, my visions, and the questions that now he surprised me by listening to me without interrupting or passing judgment. When I was done, he said quietly, "You've been shown something profound. It's normal for people who are near death to question their long-held beliefs. The important thing is to find the truth, no matter how challenging it may be." Father James offered to meet with me on a regular basis to discuss my questions and work through them. I was hesitant at first, but as our conversations progressed, I started to see things in a new light. Father James introduced me to Jesus' teachings, including the concept of grace and forgiveness, which went beyond what I had previously understood. He read passages from the Bible, and one in particular really struck me. "I am the way, the truth, and the life. No one comes to the Father except through me." His words struck a chord with me for so long. Those words broke my heart. Were they the solution I had been looking for during this period of my dreams? Every night I saw the throne once more, but this time the prophet was no longer chained. Instead, he stood tall, his face showing quiet strength instead of grief. His voice was clear, unwavering, and urgent as he repeated the same words, "Go find the truth." After weeks of prayer, introspection, and conversations with Father James, I made a decision that would forever alter my life. I asked to be baptized. It wasn't an easy one, as I knew it would alienate me from my family, my community, and the life I had built, but the peace in my heart told me it was the right one. The day of my baptism was unlike anything I had ever experienced, as the water was poured over my head, and I felt a profound sense of release, as though the chains that had bound me in my dreams and in my heart were finally broken. I felt free for the first time in my life, and the doubts, fear, and weight of my past all vanished with the water. Tears streamed down my face, but they were not tears of sorrow. They were tears of gratitude and joy. In the days that followed, something miraculous happened. The cancer that had ravaged my body began to disappear. My doctors were baffled, unable to explain the sudden reversal, but I knew who had healed me. Every morning I opened the Bible and fell to my knees in prayer. The words that came from my lips were different. Now they weren't cries of desperation, but prayers of thanks. My journey wasn't without loss. My family struggled to accept my transformation. My daughter in particular was angry and hurt. She accused me of abandoning my faith, of betraying my role as an imam. It was painful, but I knew that the path I had chosen was one of truth, and I prayed for her understanding. Over time, some relationships began to mend, though others remained strained. Even so, I was no longer afraid of being alone. I had found something greater today. I share my story not to convince anyone, but to bear witness to the transformation that is possible when we have an open heart and seek the truth. I don't claim to know everything, but I know that the peace I now experience and the joy that permeates my days are unlike anything I have ever experienced. If you've read this far, thank you for listening to my story. If it has touched you in any way, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel for more amazing tales of faith and transformation. Check out our other videos for more inspirational journeys, and never forget that the truth is always worth seeking.